Have the Germans really been trained not to think anymore? What I wish for is that we get a government in Germany that first and foremost thinks about the German people. They don't even have to be pro-Russia. It would be enough if they were neutral. Germany hasn't been a democracy for a long time. It's been a democrature for years now. Back in the 1930s, not everyone was a Nazi either. It was a minority. But at some point, they managed to pull the others along. And those who had the courage to speak up had to leave the country. I haven't done anything, I haven't killed anyone, I haven't stolen anything. All I did was claim the freedom to speak my mind openly in Germany.
Frei meine Meinung zu äußern.
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Against the Current. About the guest. Hello and welcome to Against the Current. I bring you viewpoints and reflections that the propaganda media keep from you. About my guest today, after everything she's been through, you could say she was the only man in the House. She served as a member of the Hamburg State Parliament for the AfD, now lives in Russia, works as a journalist, and was a woman on the run. Welcome, Olga Petersen.
War eine Frau auf der Flucht. Willkommen, Olga Petersen.
Hello, Patrik.
What was the escape like back then?
Ja, sie war natürlich.
Yes, it was surprisingly spontaneous, as often happens with, well, spontaneous events in life. But of course, there was a backstory. That goes without saying. It wasn't like I was just living my life and suddenly there was shooting around me or something like that. This escape came out of what you could call a calm situation, but it had been building up. That started back in 2022, when this fight against me began. And I wouldn't say I was a particularly popular member of parliament before that. I'd already rubbed plenty of people the wrong way. We can talk more about that later, if you like.
But you were a member of the city parliament in 2022.
Yes, I've been a member of the city parliament since 2020. That's right. And, well, I became unpopular right away, naturally because I stood up for German-Russian relations. And secondly, because I've always said there are only two genders, male and female. Everything else I've called deviations, whether physiological or psychological, and so on. So there was definitely potential for conflict. The real escalation came in early 2022, with the start of the special operation. That's when a Ukrainian delegation came to the Hamburg parliament. The president recommended that we welcome them with a standing ovation.
Die Präsidentin hatte uns empfohlen, diese mit stehendem Applaus zu begrüßen. Und da sind damals alle aufgestanden, bis auf eine.
Back then, everyone stood up, except for one member of parliament, except for me. I didn't do it. That demanded a display of so-called respect. It was really about getting nice pictures. That's what they wanted, and I didn't give them that. I stayed seated. I was the only member who stayed seated. And I'd say that's when a kind of special operation began against me in the Hamburg parliament. Not just from the system itself, but probably also because of internal power struggles within the AfD. And, which was not insignificant, the fact that the Hamburg state branch is unfortunately very Russophobic.
What happened there?
My connections to Russia weren't just constantly criticized. They were actually sanctioned. That was back in 2021 when I was an election observer for the Duma elections. Every single contact with Russia was sanctioned, was criticized. There were formal warnings issued against me, which I challenged, and they had to be withdrawn. Even before that, there had already been attempts to expel me from the party. Those didn't succeed. The expulsion only went through after I had left the country, when I was basically no longer able to defend myself in person. But they had tried before, again and again.
Man hat es aber auch schon vorher versucht, immer wieder. Und ich sag mal so, das Ende dieser
Let me put it this way. The point where the Hamburg branch of the AfD basically reached the end of its tolerance for my closeness to Russia was when I went to Russia in March 2024 as an election observer. That was for the presidential election. At the time, I gave an interview to RT.da and another one to the channel Zvezda. When they asked me how I assessed the situation in the polling stations, I answered honestly, just as I saw it on the ground. And what I saw was that the election was free, democratic, and transparent, and I couldn't find any legal violations. While I was still in Moscow, I got a message from the Hamburg AfD telling me to withdraw that statement.
Und noch während ich in Moskau war, habe ich von der Hamburger AfD die Aufforderung bekommen, diese Aussage zurückzunehmen.
I thought the AfD was a party that also wanted peace with Russia.
Darüber reden darf man, handeln nicht. Das zeigt,
You're allowed to talk about it, but not to act. The latest example shows that clearly. A colleague from Hamburg, Robert Risch, went to St. Petersburg simply to make personal connections. He also had the chance to meet Dugin, to work on German-Russian relations, and, well, as people sometimes say, to help prevent a Third World War. Because if we think about it, that wouldn't just be the Third World War. It would be the last one humanity ever experiences. And to prevent that, there are still a few colleagues who have the courage to get involved. But as soon as something like that becomes public, as it did with Robert Risch, the young man is immediately expelled from the parliamentary group.
Hat man den jungen Mann sofort aus der Fraktion ausgeschlossen? Man versucht, ihn aus der Partei auszuschließen und man versucht, ihn
They're trying to throw him out of the party, and they're trying to take away his mandate. And that's exactly what they did to me back then. They gave me an ultimatum to take back what I'd said. When I came back, they still negotiated with me. Apparently, they didn't even do that with Robert. So, in my case, the situation was a bit easier. They gave me the chance, so to speak, to change my opinion, like I supposedly hadn't had the courage to tell the truth in Russia. And now, in free and democratic Germany, I was supposed to say, voluntarily of course, no one would be forcing me, how things supposedly really happened, like the election hadn't been free and so on.
Dass die Wahl nicht frei war, etc. pp. Warum das Ganze? Ja, weil Olaf Scholz ja...
Why all of this? Well, because back then, Olaf Scholz also refused to recognize the election of Vladimir Vladimirovich, meaning he basically didn't see him as the legitimate president of the Russian Federation. And at the time, I said on Russia Today Germany that the election was free, democratic, and transparent. Then, for example, RT asked me something like, so are we partly responsible for the fact that you were later targeted in Germany because of that? No, that's not the case.
Nein, das ist es ja nicht. Das Einzige, was RT.de damals ausgezeichnet hat, ist, die haben...
The only thing that really set RT.de apart back then was this. They aired everything, no matter what someone said. It wasn't that RT.de was somehow responsible for it, it was my opinion, and they just broadcast every opinion freely. And that's exactly why they were later sanctioned, or rather banned, in Germany. When I was still in Moscow, I was advised not to go back to Germany. They said it would be too dangerous. But I had to return, because 3 of my 4 children were still there. 1 child was with me in Moscow, but the others were still in Hamburg. So I went back. And as it turned out, the entire machinery of the legal system was set in motion against me.
Die gesamte Maschinerie des Rechtsstaates gegen mich aufgefahren. Man hatte mich aus der Fraktion ausgeschlossen. Man hatte versucht, mich aus der Partei
They kicked me out of the parliamentary group, and they even tried to throw me out of the party. The, let's say, propaganda machine that was set in motion against me reached a level I could never have imagined. I kept thinking, who am I really? I mean, I'm just a small state parliament member. I'm no threat to German democracy. Honestly, not in the slightest. I don't want to downplay myself, but I'm realistic. I understand that as a small state legislator, I can't possibly be a danger to Germany. But for some reason, maybe it was the desire to make an example out of me, they took that opportunity, one that this German system apparently allowed.
Die man genutzt hat von diesem deutschen System. Als man gesehen hat, man kriegt mich nicht sozusagen in die Enge getrieben, man kann mich nicht kaufen,
When they realized
man
they
kann
couldn't
mich nicht
corner me,
erpressen,
couldn't buy me,
da hat man
couldn't
ein
blackmail
Mittel
me,
gewählt,
they chose a
welches,
different
für
tactic.
jeden,
One that I'd say
sag ich mal, für
hits
jedes
every
Elternteil, jeden
parent,
Menschen, der
every
Kinder hat.
person with children, right where it
Ein
hurts.
beliebtes, aber ein
They
sehr
went after my
schreckliches
kids.
Mittel, ja. Man hat sich sozusagen
Over the
an meine Kinder
years, in this
rangewandt.
system, you don't just make enemies,
In all den
you also
Jahren
make
gewinnt man ja
friends.
in diesem
And
System
one of
nicht
them
nur
told
Feinde,
me
sondern
there was a
auch Freunde.
file about me at the Youth Welfare
Und
Office
ist
and
jetzt
what
getragen
kind of
worden, dass es
ideas and
Verfügung
motives were behind
gibt.
it.
Und
In the end, the goal
welche
was clear.
Ideen
They
dahinter
wanted to
stecken,
make my
beziehungsweise was
life as
sozusagen
hard
der
as
Sinn der Sache
possible.
ist. Also unterm Strich,
And the
man
best way to do
wollte
that is
mir
to
das
take a
Leben so
parent's
schwer wie
children
möglich
away.
machen. Und das kann man am besten machen, wenn man einem Elternteil die Kinder wegnimmt. Die werden
Weren't they basically trying to take them down?
Ich gehe davon aus, ja.
I'd say
Also
yes.
Eltern werden Kooperationen
Parents tend to become more
bereiter,
cooperative when their
wenn
children
man
are
ihnen
taken
die
away,
Kinder wegnimmt
and that's used
und
as
das
leverage
als
against them.
Druckmittel gegen sie nutzt.
A form of blackmail.
Richtig. Und das ist eine Form der Erpressung, die funktioniert
Exactly.
natürlich bei den meisten
And that's a
Eltern.
form of blackmail that works on most parents because where are we vulnerable as parents? Through our
Mir
children.
bleibt nicht mehr viel Zeit. Ich
When I
muss noch
found that
Kinder
out, I
verlangen.
knew I didn't have much time left.
Also haben
I had to
wir
get my
unsere
kids out of
Sachen
the
gepackt.
country. So we
Ich
packed our
habe
things.
nur so viel
I only
zusammengepackt, wie wir
packed what
selber
we could
tragen
carry
konnten.
ourselves, one
Also
backpack
pro
of
Person
clothes
einen
per
Rucksack an
person.
Klamotten. Es war Gott sei Dank
Luckily, it
Sommer.
was summer. And I told the
Und ich habe
kids,
gesagt,
each of
jedes
you
Kind
can
darf noch
take
mit
one
einer
small
Tasche
bag
mit
with
den
your most
wichtigsten
important
Gegenständen
things, some
mitnehmen.
toys,
Also
whatever
ein
fits, just a
Spielzeug,
small bag.
irgendwas, eine
Only
kleine
what we
Tasche.
can
Das,
carry
was wir
ourselves.
selbst tragen können.
Because I had
Weil ich
no
wusste
idea
nicht, wie
how
wir
we'd get
unterwegs
across
sein
the
werden.
border.
Ich wusste
I
nicht,
didn't
ob
even
ich
know if I
überhaupt
was
noch
still allowed to
Ausreise
leave the
fähig bin,
country, if I
sozusagen,
could
ob
get
ich
out at
überhaupt noch
all.
rauskomme.
Then we set off
Dann
and
sind
reached the
wir
border.
losgefahren,
Estonia,
sind an
Russia.
die Grenze gekommen, Estland, Russland. Und da habe ich dann erfahren, dass ich nicht rauskomme. Die Gründe
And that's when I
konnte mir
found
also
out I
die
wasn't
junge
getting
Dame
out.
am Tresen nicht
The young
sagen.
woman at the counter couldn't
Konnte
tell
mir
me
nur
why.
sagen, tut mir
All she
leid,
could say
ich kann
was,
sie hier nicht aufnehmen.
I'm sorry,
Ich
I
habe mich
can't
dann an meine
admit you
Freunde,
here.
an die Journalisten gewandt, weil ich die Hoffnung
So I
hatte,
turned
dass
to
die
my friends,
Aufmerksamkeit
to the
der Presse
journalists,
zumindest ein Stück
because I
weit mich
hoped that
schützt
media
vor
attention might at least offer me
unbegrenzter
some protection from the
Willkür
unchecked
des
power of
Jugendamtes
the
oder
Youth
des
Welfare
Rechtstaats.
Office or the
Und
legal
ich habe
system.
dann die
I reached
Journalisten
out
und
to
meine
the
Bekannten
journalists I
informiert
knew
und habe
and
auch
asked them to report on it,
sozusagen
just in case
Berichterstattung
something
gebeten,
happened.
falls
That's how it came about
irgendwas
that one of my
auffällig sein
journalist
sollte.
friends said,
Und
Olga,
so hat sich das
I've
ergeben,
got
dass
good
einer meiner
contacts and
bekannten
I'll connect
Journalisten
you with
sagte, Olga,
them.
ich habe gute Kontakte,
These people will
die
help
werde
you.
ich dir zur Verfügung stellen.
And they
Diese
did
Menschen
help
werden
me.
dir
It took a
helfen.
total of 5 days
Und die haben
before
mir
we were
geholfen.
finally
Es hat
able
zwar
to get out.
insgesamt 5 Tage gedauert, bis wir rausgebracht worden sind.
Und es war
And it was the border between Estonia and Belarus.
Nein, das sind so die Punkte, über die ich natürlich
No,
nicht
those are
sprechen
exactly the
kann.
points I'm
Ja,
not allowed to talk
denn
about. There have always
es
been
sind immer
opportunities to
wieder
leave the country,
Möglichkeiten, sag
and
ich mal,
thankfully
aus
from
einer
time to
Land zu
time,
kommen, und die gibt es
those
Gott
still
sei Dank
exist.
dann zum Teil
Gaps
immer
open up
noch
here and
an.
there, although it's
Bildet
getting
sich der
harder and
Lücke,
harder.
wobei es immer schwieriger wird natürlich.
Und da haben
And did
wir
those contacts help you leave the EU?
EU zu verlassen.
Ganz genau. Allerdings, um diese Korridore zu schützen, darf man
Exactly.
natürlich nicht
But to
sozusagen im
protect
Detail
those
einmal sagen. Es
corridors,
gibt
of
aber
course,
zahlreiche
you
Personen,
can't
die
really
sowas
go into
versucht
detail
haben,
about them.
und viele viele andere
Still, there are
Fälschen
quite a few
Formen
people who
sozusagen
managed to get out that way. Ruslan Pankratov, Leona Kilic, and many others who were, I'd say, completely destroyed by the EU system. Ruslan Pankratov wasn't even from Germany, but the system broke them down to the core, really destroyed them. Some ended up in prison, others barely escaped it. And there's this Russian saying that means, we don't abandon our own. And that's true. Anyone who stayed loyal to the German-Russian relationship, who didn't let themselves be bought off by BlackRock or any other organization, those people are respected by Russia. And when they're in trouble, they get help.
Und wenn sie in Not geraten, dann wird ihnen auch geholfen.
Ist denn
From your point of view, is the EU still democratic at all?
noch demokratisch?
Nein, das sehen wir auch schon alleine am Parlament.
No,
Also,
we can already see that
die
just by
Regeln,
looking
die
at the
sozusagen
parliament.
im
The
EU-Parlament
rules that are
getroffen
made
werden,
in the EU Parliament
stehen stets über der
always take
Gesetzgebung
precedence
des
over the
eigenen
laws of
Landes,
each
ja?
individual country.
Aber
But in that sense, you can't really elect the
das
parliament at
Parlament
all.
in dem Sinne eigentlich gar nicht wählen.
Europeans have no
Also,
real
der
influence over who ends up
Europäer hat
making
keinen
which
Einfluss
decisions there.
darauf,
The
wer
only thing they
später
can
welche
actually take
Entscheidungen
part in
dort drin
is
trifft.
supporting their
Das
own
Einzige,
parties
was
at
sie
home.
entscheiden können,
So those
ist, dass sie
parties
in
go to
ihrem
Brussels
Land
with a stronger
jeweils
position.
ihre Parteien unterstützen und die dann in einer gestärkten Größe nach Brüssel gehen. Ja?
Es gibt doch
There are European elections, of course, but the Commission is appointed.
Zusammengestellt. Und darauf hat
In that sense, the European citizen, or in this case the German citizen, has absolutely no influence over how this commission is put together. And these are the decisions that stand above the laws made in our own country. That's important to understand. EU law always takes precedence over German law. But the German citizen has no say in who makes those decisions or who creates those laws. That's why, for me, this is not a democratic system.
When you left the EU, the authorities in Hamburg must have been involved, and probably the ones in Brussels too, or maybe officials from other countries as well.
So that brings us back to the question, who actually supported me in all this, and who tried to stop me? In both cases, there was definitely some kind of cooperation. But as I said, my supporters will remain anonymous. The only person I'm allowed to name is the contact. He agreed to that. Everyone else, of course, did not. Because, unfortunately, it's not just about getting across the border. After that, you also have to be legalized, you need the proper documents, and so on.
How did that go?
So, it basically went like this. At some point, I arrived in Russia. Suddenly I found myself somewhere in this world, in the post-Soviet region, and I had no idea what would happen next.
And that's with children involved.
And that was with kids. The only thing I'd entered into the navigation system was Russian Federation. Then I called the journalist who had connected me, and I asked him, okay, I'm here now. Do you have any advice on what to do next? And he said, Olga, come to Moscow, and we'll take it from there. So I went to Moscow. And that's when, of course, the challenge of bureaucracy began.
So you drove to Moscow?
Ich war ja mit dem Auto unterwegs. Also mit meinen Kindern da drin, mit dem Hund. Wir hatten noch einen Hund mitgenommen. Die Kinder haben gesagt, der Hund kommt mit. Und so sind wir dann irgendwann in Moskau, ja, es war schon mitten in der Nacht angekommen, mit den Kindern und einem Hund. Dann bin ich in das erste Hotel rein, da haben die gesagt, deutsche Pässe akzeptieren wir nicht. Zumindest nicht ohne sozusagen einen Garant. Hatten mir aber sofort auch geholfen, wie ich an ein Hotelzimmer komme oder an eine Unterkunft komme. Man muss dazu sagen, die Sicherheitsvorkehrungen in Russland sind sehr hoch. Und ich nenne es jetzt mal, fehlenden Unterlagen hat man es schwierig voranzukommen. Also musste ich irgendwann meine Unterlagen erstmal mir beschaffen.
And that's where the challenge of Russian bureaucracy began. It's partly simplified by digitalization, something that's still missing in Germany. So the offices you have to visit in person, yes, you really do have to go there. You actually get the documents you need, and once you know where to go, things move pretty quickly. But figuring out where to go in the first place can take a little while. After that, most of it happens digitally. And at some point, things started moving forward again. For me personally, of course. I had to ask myself, what do I do with myself now?
You need a place to live, you need to register your kids for school, you need valid ID papers, a residence permit. There's quite a lot that comes together there.
There's quite a lot coming together there, but as I said, all of it can be solved. Where there's a will, there's a way. My bigger problem was, how was I supposed to make a living? I wasn't the first sitting member of parliament, so to speak, to go from Germany to Russia. There were others before me. Back in the 1930s, there were a few communists who went from Germany to Russia. But at that time, I was still running in my district. They just didn't manage to kick me off the list on such short notice. And since I had survived until the election, which, unlike me, some of my AfD colleagues didn't manage to do this time around in the 2 local elections, well, I was still alive back then. So it was pretty hard for my colleagues to kick me off the list. And believe it or not, I was actually the first member of parliament, the first German MP, to be re-elected while absent. I ended up getting a direct mandate and suddenly found myself back in parliament.
40% or more in Harburg in your district.
At my polling station, not in my whole district, just at my polling station, I actually got around 40% of the vote. And in the surrounding ones too, the results were good to very, very good. When all the votes were counted, there was this big moment of surprise. I had come in third place in my district in Harburg and was basically elected directly. At that point, no one really knew what to do with me. And that was the first time in German history that the Hamburg State Parliament had to come together and actually vote on taking away a member's rights, basically stripping her of her mandate. Some Russian colleagues, well, I didn't speak with them personally, but through other contacts, asked me whether that was really possible, whether it was seriously possible to get rid of an elected representative, essentially a directly elected one, just by a vote in parliament, to simply wave it through.
I have my doubts about that too. Maybe you could lift immunity in cases of serious crimes.
They did the same thing to me. It's basically just a means to an end, but it didn't really help much. They keep doing that to Björn Höcke, too. I think he holds the record in the AfD for having his parliamentary immunity lifted. At some point, I even told Björn, I'm going to give you some competition now. No, but seriously, this was the first time. It's a precedent. Nothing like this had happened before. And there had also never been a case where a member of parliament was abroad. Of course, after a while, there were these quiet voices from Germany saying things like, it's not that bad, come back, you've got all the attention now, nothing will happen to you, the attention itself protects you. I'll be honest, I don't want to find out, because if I were there, I'd be vulnerable to blackmail. In Russia, I can say and do what I want, as long as it's within the law, of course, without being blackmailed through my children. No one tells me what I'm allowed to say or not say. In Germany, they actually tried that directly.
They tried to take my children away from me.
That's right, there was one. But to this day, I still haven't received the file from the Youth Welfare Office. I still don't know what's in it. Journalists who apparently had access to it spoke of my children being neglected.
Are they neglected?
Thank God, no. When I told my kids about it, and the older ones are, let's say, old enough to think for themselves. My oldest is 24, turning 25, then 16, 13, and 10. So the older ones basically just laughed. They didn't really have any arguments for or against it. They just said, look, with all due respect, there are no problems in a family if no one tries to create them. And that's exactly what happened. Someone tried to cause trouble for the family. And as for the younger ones, I should add this too. I was still hoping I could cross the border between Estonia and Russia and leave the country freely, drive out myself, so to speak. We told the youngest kids we were going on vacation. We told the neighbors and everyone else the same thing. Because honestly, we didn't know for sure how things would turn out. And I'll put it this way. By the third day at the latest, when we had to hide somewhere in the Baltics, the kids said, Mom, this vacation isn't really fun. Of course, they didn't understand. They were used to vacations where, we'd be lying on a beach in Turkey or something like that, and suddenly they found themselves sitting in a car, waiting it out in some forest. But I told them, once we get there, everything will be fine. When we crossed the border, of course, my oldest daughter immediately wanted to tell the youngest that it was a one-way ticket. I said, please, I haven't slept in 5 days. Let me close my eyes for half an hour and then I'll explain the whole situation. So we start driving, just calmly on the road. It was sometime in the morning. Then my youngest daughter and my youngest son see some kids walking outside and ask, "Mom, why are those kids out there? Why aren't they in school?" And I said, no, in Russia they have 3 months of summer vacation. The whole summer is vacation, so that's why the kids are off.
Und deswegen haben die Kinder frei. Und dann meinte die jüngste Tochter, oh, das ist toll, dann will ich auch.
And then my youngest daughter said, "Oh, that's great, then I want to stay here too." And the oldest was like, "Yeah, you're staying too, don't worry." And I thought, okay, so now I was basically forced to explain the situation to my kids. The little ones were shocked for a moment, of course. Surprised. What's happening in their lives now? They went to sleep yesterday as the children of a member of parliament, and they woke up in the middle of Russia as homeless kids. What's happening to their lives right now? And my oldest daughter put it really well. She said, "What's the most important thing? The most important thing is that the family stays together. Mom made that happen, so she did everything right."
Das hat Mama geschafft. Also alles richtig gemacht.
How did the children manage to find their footing in this new world of life in Russia?
Die ersten Tage waren so voller.
The first few days were just packed with new impressions and experiences. At times, we didn't even know what was happening to us. You really have to process that as a person first. After a few days, I started to bring some structure into it all, to figure out what we were going to do with our lives now. How would things move forward? How would I support us? Because I was the only one earning an income in the family. So how was I going to manage that? The kids needed to go to school. They needed an education. Pretty soon, I found a school, the BRICS School. It's an international school run by the BRICS countries.
Die BRICS-Schule, das ist eine internationale Schule der BRICS-Staaten. Die unterrichten zum Teil eben in Englisch und auch
They teach partly in English and also in Russian. To make things a bit easier for my kids, I first sent them to that school, just so they were settled somewhere. Later on, we said, okay, the kids really need to learn Russian, not just the everyday language, but enough to eventually get proper vocational training here in this country. So they need solid, professional Russian. After working with the private tutors I had hired, I decided the kids should go to a regular public school.
Jetzt sind sie auf einer ganz normalen Schule. Es gibt die Möglichkeit.
Now they're at a regular school. There's also the option for homeschooling or online classes. That means when I'm on the road and I travel a lot, in the Donbass and in other regions, in places where I can take my kids with me, I'm happy to do so. And there they can join their classes online. Why does that work so well in Russia? Because it's been done for years, actually for decades. It's a well-established system that's been refined and improved over many years.
Auch perfektioniert wurde. In Deutschland gab es ja das Problem, dass wir in Corona-Zeiten plötzlich.
In Germany, we had this problem during the pandemic when we suddenly realized we only have in-person classes and there's no alternative. In Russia, you actually have a whole range of options for how you want your child to be educated. And for us, as I said, we found the best option. It's a regular public school, but with the possibility to complete certain parts online. Because in Russia, there's no strict requirement to attend school in person. You can adjust that. And since I work in journalism, so to speak, I can take my kids with me and they can continue their lessons online.
Kann ich meine Kinder mitnehmen und die können online unterrichtet werden. Durch die Präsenz aber, wenn wir in Moskau sind, dass die Kinder zur Schule gehen, haben die
But
Kinder
by
die Möglichkeit,
being in Moscow, with the kids going to school there, they've had the chance to make friends and build connections. And what's really nice is that after a year, they've now formed a circle of friends, an international circle actually, where they've really found a sense of belonging. That makes settling into a new country so much easier. In that group are children who also came from Germany, from Austria, from the Netherlands, from Ireland, from Denmark, from Hungary, and from Serbia. I hope I haven't forgotten any of the countries their friends come from.
Ich hoffe, ich habe jetzt keinen der Freunde vergessen aus den Ländern, aus denen sie stammen.
Would you say there's now a kind of Western European colony of exiles in Moscow?
Ich würde das nicht als Kolonie bezeichnen. Weil wir sind ja auch
I wouldn't call it a colony because most of us came from different European countries, or even from non-European ones, but I'd say from countries shaped by Western culture. What unites us is a shared fate. We had to leave our home, or the place we had chosen to live, because staying there was made impossible, for whatever reason. If you look at people like Thomas Rupper, who was even mentioned on the latest sanctions list, or Alina Lipp and many others, these are people who've lost their homes, who've lost their families.
Ihre Heimat verloren, sie haben ihre Familie verloren. Und dann ist es fast gleichgültig, ob man jetzt nun die
And then it almost doesn't matter whether you came straight from Germany or from the Netherlands. At first, you're on your own here, and then you start connecting with people who've been through more or less the same kind of experience, no matter how they got here, whether it was like us, traveling overland by car, which I'd say was almost a dramatic escape, or people who came to Russia simply out of curiosity, fell in love with the country, and decided to stay. There are all kinds of stories, but there's one thing that connects us all.
Es gibt ja verschiedenste Schicksale, aber uns verbindet eins. Wir sind nach Russland gekommen, ein Land,
We came to Russia.
Deutschen haben wir nicht in Deutschland bekommen, wie wir sie hier in Russland bekommen. Ja?
In der EU,
In the EU, especially in Germany, Russia is portrayed as a dictatorship. And now you're telling me that freedom rights in the EU are being restricted.
in der EU eingeschränkt werden.
Deutschland ist schon lange keine Demokratie.
Germany hasn't been a real democracy for a long time. For quite some time now, it's been more of a democratorship. The only thing that still sets it apart from a dictatorship is that people can go vote. But what we're seeing more and more often, even here in Germany, and sometimes even openly, is what Stalin once said. It's not important how people vote, it's important how the votes are counted. We saw that in the last federal election with Sarah Wagenknecht. They did a recount and suddenly discovered a few thousand more votes, and now she's missing a few thousand votes again. So they just stopped counting. Now she's trying, of course, to assert her rights and is demanding a new count.
Ja, und verlangt Neuauszählung. Ich glaube aber nicht, dass das sehr erfolgreich
I don't think that's going to be very successful, because the people who are disadvantaged by it are the ones who get to decide whether there's a recount or not. That's why I'm afraid it won't work out. But that issue already existed before. I think it was back in 2020, the first time I was really surprised by what can happen in Germany. Back then, in Thuringia, the state premier was elected, and the person who became premier was from the Free Democratic Party. It wasn't someone from the AfD or from any party that, let me put it this way, is being pursued by the rule of law, the way the AfD keeps being targeted by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution and so on.
eingestuft zu werden und so weiter. Es war die FDP, also eine Partei, die dann später sogar in die
It was the FDP, a party that later even joined the Traffic Light Coalition. But back then, Merkel had basically sent a message from Africa, let's call it that, saying this election had to be reversed, it had to be redone, and right away a new vote was held. Then the Left Party came back to the top, with the approval of the CDU, that's important to mention. Merz talks today about a firewall against the AfD, but there used to be a firewall against the left too. It only lasted or was only applied when it benefited the CDU. And that was the moment when I first realized what's actually possible in the German rule of law, something I had thought was impossible.
Was in dem deutschen Rechtsstaat möglich ist, was ich für unmöglich gehalten hatte.
Wenn du das mal
If you compare that with Russia, where do you feel freer?
In what sense free?
frei in dem Sinne,
Free in the sense that you can live your life on your own terms, act the way you choose, and lead an independent life.
selbstständiges Leben führen kannst.
Ja, da ist es.
Yeah, I have to admit, as much as I love Germany, the answer is Russia.
Würdest du
Would you say you're a patriot?
Ja, aber ich bin eine Russlanddeutsche. Ich bin eine
Yes, but I'm a Russian German. I'm a Russian German patriot. And I'd almost say that's become a nationality of its own by now. Because of the long history and all the experiences Russian Germans have gone through, they've really become their own people. And in every reasonable Russian German heart, there are always two sides beating. One is German, you could say, by heritage, and the other is Russian because of family history. Russian Germans are deeply connected to Russia. They've spent centuries living there.
Sie haben Jahrhunderte in Russland verbracht. Zum Teil sich natürlich auch vermischt mit den Russen, angeheiratet.
In some cases, of course, people have mixed with Russians, married into Russian families, and so on. For me personally, Russia and Germany will always be like mother and father. It's always Mother Russia and Father Germany. That will never change. I never want to see these two countries played against each other. It's important to me that German-Russian relations reach a level where we can shake hands as equals, where we can work together as equals, culturally and economically, because I believe Germany actually needs that even more than Russia.
Denn ich glaube, Deutschland braucht das sogar mehr als Russland.
Gibt es da noch eine Chance?
Is there still any chance of going back to the status quo ante, to the time before the war, when there was a German-Russian energy partnership, a cultural partnership?
Einer kulturellen Partnerschaft?
Ich hoffe ja.
I sure hope so. Personally, I'm ready to give my full commitment to that, no matter where I am. I did it in Germany, and now I'm doing it in Russia, because it matters. It's important that these two countries work together, combining German capabilities for development, so to speak, with Russian resources. Together we'd be unbeatable worldwide. No one could compete with us. But we keep letting ourselves get divided, and that's exactly what I want to prevent, that we get divided.
Who are the dividers?
Die von Kriegen profitieren.
The ones who profit from wars. And when they got bored with just setting Muslims against each other, they started turning Slavs against one another. Because Ukrainians and Russians are both Slavic peoples. They were once so closely connected that they were a single country. And even today, families are deeply intertwined. But at some point, people in Ukraine started being radicalized. Just a minority, though. As a Russian German, I'm allowed to draw these parallels. Back in the 1930s, not everyone was a Nazi either. It was a minority. But eventually they managed to pull the others along, and those who had the courage to speak up had to leave the country. Unfortunately, that's something we're seeing again here in Germany. So those who talk about peace, well, in the AfD, you're allowed to.
In der AfD darf man.
You just have to make sure not to do anything about it.
As soon as you start working to truly promote understanding between our two peoples, you end up being sanctioned by your own party.
You know the inner workings of the AfD. Are the transatlanticists gaining the upper hand?
Auf kommunaler Ebene, nein.
At the local level, no. There are still some genuinely honest voices that want to work for German-Russian relations. But once we move up to the state level, it already gets tricky, depending on the regional branch. There are still some state branches that are sincerely interested in a German-Russian friendship. But once we get to the Berlin level, well, I wouldn't say it gets thin. I'd say there aren't any left. And that's why, when Alice Weidel talks about maintaining friendship or friendly relations with Russia, I have to ask myself, who exactly does she plan to do that with, when she's surrounded only by transatlanticists? I'm not even saying she's being dishonest in that moment. I just wonder, what team does she think she's going to do that with?
Ich frage mich nur, mit welchem Team will sie das anstellen?
Man kann natürlich überlegen.
Of course, one can ask whether, given its current polling numbers, the AfD is a party that might take part in a coalition after the next federal election. So in your view, would the AfD then turn in a more transatlantic direction, like we saw with Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who traveled to Washington and came back seemingly transformed?
Sie reist nach Washington und kommt geläutert zurück.
Natürlich möchte die AfD koalitionsfähig werden und man kann es auch ein Stück weit.
Of course, the AfD wants to become capable of forming coalitions, and to some extent you can understand that, because, to put it bluntly, they've swallowed dirt for so long, now they finally want a seat at the trough. And I'm afraid it might not even take an election or a coalition for that to happen. Most of them, especially Alice Weidel, are now pro-NATO, pro-Western. And I don't think they need much more integration into this Western system, because they're already comfortably settled in it.
Die Stimmen, die noch auf Landesebene,
The voices that still exist at the state level, the ones interested in the bilateral relations between our two countries, Russia and Germany. What will happen to them? I honestly don't know right now, or how they'll be dealt with. One of the few people I still know who's genuinely and seriously interested in maintaining a good relationship with Russia is Bjorn Höcke. Alice Weidel can't really get around him, even though she's tried several times. So she's probably come to some kind of arrangement with him. As for what will happen to him, I just hope that by then he's strong enough and influential enough to survive this purge within the AfD as well.
Now, of course, the firewall that the ruling party cartel has built against the AfD is basically the ruling cartel's own life insurance. Should that firewall come down?
Natürlich hat Merz diese Brandmauer aufgestellt, aber
Of course, Merz set up that firewall. But we also have to say, back then he promised it. He promised there would be this firewall and that it would hold. In a way, I even thought that firewall was a good thing because it allowed the AfD to grow internally without being too heavily influenced. You know? But he also promised to cut the AfD's results in half through his strong, competent policies. And now the AfD is doing better than ever. I think that firewall will only hold until the people vote for a result, let me put it that way, where no other coalition is even possible anymore. And then they'll turn to the AfD. We also shouldn't forget that in the eastern states, the Sarah Wagenknecht alliance is not insignificant either. She's already hinted that when the time comes, she'd be willing to consider a coalition with the AfD, and at that point, the established parties would be completely out.
You've been traveling here in Russia as a journalist, and you've also been to the war zone in the Donbass. How do the people you met there see Germany today?
For many years, decades really, people looked up to Germany. It was for them a shining example of a thriving economy and of strong international economic relations. In Europe, it was seen as the cradle of democracy. But today, especially after Ms. Baerbock's feminist foreign policy, people aren't just disappointed. They're saying, we no longer have a partner in Europe we can look up to. The next partner we had, after all, was Germany, through Kaliningrad and Poland. And that's why the German-Russian relationship has always meant a lot to us, because we always felt that we enriched each other. But if we look at what you value today, or what Germany is proud of, things like feminist foreign policy, the rainbow flag on the Bundestag, and all those other symbols, that's something we just can't relate to. We don't see ourselves in that. How is it possible that the country of poets and thinkers is now even mangling its own language?
Sogar die eigene Sprache verhunzt.
So on one side we have gender-inclusive language, on the other side the rainbow colors, and Russia is leaning more toward traditional values, family, homeland, the state. Has this turned into a culture war?
Kulturkampf, ich glaube, das ist der Kampf in jedem Einzelnen drinnen.
I think that's a struggle inside every single person. What are we striving for? What really matters to us? And the Russians, they've had a moment of reflection where they said, stop. What defines us as human beings? That's the foundation. Those are our roots. It's faith in God. It's the family as the basis of our lives. In Russia, the smallest unit of the state is the family. When I said in Germany that I have 4 children, people often asked if I didn't have any other hobbies. But when I say in Russia that I have 4 children, most people say that's great respect.
Dann sagen die meistens sehr gut Respekt. Wenn ich in Deutschland mit meinen Kindern
When I'm in Germany with my kids, well, I haven't taken the train much lately, but on the rare occasions when I did, and I showed up there as a mother with several children, I was looked at with contempt, labeled as antisocial, even though I'm a sitting member of parliament. When I take the metro in Russia with my kids, people make room for us, not because my children are small, but because I'm a mother with many children. Students stand up and offer me their seat. Of course, at some point I asked kind of jokingly, do I look that old or that tired? And they said, no, it's just that with so many kids, it's good if you can rest for a bit. It's simply a different attitude.
Es ist ein anderes Verständnis. Wenn Kinder in der Schule
When kids at school say they have 2, 3, or 4 siblings, in Germany people often respond, don't your parents have anything better to do? In Russia they say, oh, that's great. Do you have pictures of your family? That's wonderful. Do you all go on vacation together? You can actually enjoy free vacation time as a family. Didn't you know that? You just have to apply for it here or there. So families are really supported. When I show up at a supermarket with my kids and there's a long line, people are happy to let me go ahead. When I get on a train with them, someone makes room for us. Even at government offices, you can tell that when you arrive as a large family, you're not exactly given special treatment, but you are allowed to go first, and things are made a bit easier for you.
Es wird einem erleichtert, sozusagen die Arbeit. Es heißt, ja, ich fülle das für Sie aus, ich mache das alles schnell.
They say, sure, I'll fill that out for you, I'll take care of everything right away. You can really sense a completely different attitude toward families. You get the feeling, especially as a mother of 4 children, I don't want to say you're given special treatment, but honestly, that's the right word. You are given preference, whereas in Germany, families are at a disadvantage. And that's actually why I joined the AfD back then, because the AfD said we need a culture of welcome for our own children, the ones we bring into the world, not for illiterate foreigners coming in here. And in Russia, and we shouldn't forget this, we're also migrants, in a way.
In Russland sind wir ebenfalls Migranten, wenn man so will. Wir sind aus Deutschland gekommen.
We came from Germany, but nobody here really cares about that because this is a multi-ethnic country. People speak dozens of languages. Hundreds, actually. Nobody cares as long as you behave yourself and respect Russian law. And that's actually quite remarkable. If you don't know something, people come up to you and say, hey, just so you know, this is how we do it here. They're very nice, very polite. They point it out to you. Nobody calls the police right away, or child services, or anything like that. You're not immediately put on display like, look, the migrants can't behave. Instead, they just show you how it's done. And I think that's part of this cultural struggle, something each of us has to face, asking ourselves, what do I want and how do I want to live?
In jedem selbst zu sagen, was möchte ich? Wie möchte ich leben? Das war mal, es vielleicht ein bisschen besser auch bildlich.
Let me put it in a more visual way. I once looked at a social survey from Ukraine online. In it, young Ukrainians were asked, why do you want to join the EU? And they said, well, in the EU there's democracy. Okay, but it's in your own hands to have democracy in your own country too. Officially, Ukraine already had a democracy at that time. So apparently they weren't satisfied with their own democracy. Then they said, well, people behave better there. In the EU, in Germany, for example, people are more polite and friendly. But what's stopping you from being polite and friendly to each other in Ukraine?
Untereinander höflich und freundlich zu sein in der Ukraine. Keiner. Ja, die Straßen sind sauberer.
No one. Yes, the streets are cleaner. But what's stopping you from keeping your own streets clean? Take care of your own surroundings. It's not like the EU is going to come and clean your streets for you. Everyone has to decide for themselves where they want to live and how they want to live there. Keep your environment clean and pure. Keep your thoughts clear. Live by the values that matter to you, whether that's Christianity or simply the basic values of respecting and honoring others. Once you've made that decision for yourself, you can actually be happy in any country as long as nothing is being forced on you from the outside. And that's something we're seeing more and more here in Germany.
Und das ist in Deutschland immer mehr der Fall.
When you look at the shattered state of Europe today, the war in Ukraine, the economic war against Russia, and this cultural confrontation, this battle of propaganda, can that divide ever be healed? What do you think?
Propaganda war. You put that very well. A real split has developed, and it came out of this propaganda war. Back in 2014, even the German media reported on who had taken positions in the Kiev government after a legitimately elected government was overthrown. That's a fact. With snipers who at the time were financed by Europe. It wasn't the Ukrainian government back then that had snipers shoot at its own people. And as this propaganda kept gaining ground, as I said, in 2014, you could still find it in the German media, and you can still find it online today, that U.S. citizens had taken positions in the Kiev government, and that representatives of the fascist Azov battalion had taken positions there.
Bataillon Azov Platz gefunden haben. Damals hatte man noch in Deutschland darüber gesprochen. Heute findet man nichts mehr darüber.
Back then, people in Germany were still talking about it. Today, you can't find anything about it anymore. Now, those people are called radical patriots. And if we look at what the German media are reporting, well, we talked about this before the show, I basically torture myself every morning by watching the news from Germany over breakfast. And in that same newscast, when I see a German anchor talking about how the aggressive Russian regime in Kiev supposedly dropped a few bombs, somehow, I think 10 people were injured, 2 of them seriously.
10 Personen verletzt, 2 davon schwer. In der gleichen Nachrichtensendung wird davon berichtet.
In that same news broadcast, they report that Israel has destroyed a certain number of schools in the Gaza Strip and that a certain number of children have been killed. Then the anchor in the studio asks the reporter on the ground, well, why don't people just flee? And the reporter there answers very honestly, probably without any prepared text. She just says, well, first, there's nowhere left for them to go. And second, most of them are so weak from hunger that they can't even move anymore. She says that just like that in the very same news broadcast. Still, the takeaway at the end of the news broadcast is always the same. The Russian is evil and aggressive, and Netanyahu is our partner. And no one questions that, not even in Germany. Have the Germans really been trained out of thinking for themselves? I keep asking myself, how are we ever supposed to bridge this divide when people have been degraded to the point that they just consume these little bites of news on the evening broadcast, enjoy them, and can no longer question or think independently? Today's news programs, and yesterday's too, are full of it. Putin is backing down. Putin is supposedly reaching out to Trump. He's ready to talk, ready to cooperate.
Gesprächsbereit, kooperationsbereit.
The question here is this. Putin said, it's enough if we now admit this as a full oblast into the Russian Federation. That was the background.
Nein, der Hintergrund war ein bisschen...
No, the background was kind of like you described it. Putin said he demands that Donetsk be, so to speak, liberated from Ukrainian forces. That exact statement from Putin was taken, and then people said Putin is backing down. But they're not looking at the current military situation. Luhansk doesn't need to be liberated anymore. Luhansk is, I think, about 99.5% liberated. There are still a few individuals who manage from time to time to cross the border and carry out what I'll call small actions there. But the area itself is liberated. So Putin isn't demanding Luhansk anymore. He already controls that territory. And he's not demanding Zaporizhia or Kherson either, because he's already created the corridor he wanted.
Everything eastern, that's in Jepa.
Richtig.
Right, he's basically already achieved that. So it doesn't need to be liberated anymore. He already has it. Why did he demand liberation before? Well, because the area wasn't liberated yet. Now he doesn't have to ask for that anymore. The only place where fighting is still going on, where things haven't been completely cleared, is Donetsk. And that's why he's only talking about Donetsk now, not the other regions. That's not backing down. It's simply acknowledging that the others have already been taken. And Putin never wanted Kiev in the first place.
How do you see the chances for peace?
I see the chances for peace as very good, if the Western powers, especially those profiting from the war, keep their hands out of it. My concern is that these talks, the ones now happening between Putin and Trump and moving more and more toward peace, are being increasingly sabotaged. By whom? By the EU. Why? Because Ukraine's defeat would also be a defeat for Merz and the others, for von der Leyen and the rest as well. They bet on Ukraine, so what are they supposed to tell their citizens now? How is Merz supposed to stand up and say, yes, we had to surrender? He's practically made this war his own. Will he be able to pin it all on the scapegoat Zelensky? I'm afraid not.
If the warmongers end up calling the shots in Germany too, can you imagine ever going back there?
What I wish for is that we get a government in Germany that, first and foremost, thinks about the German people. They don't even have to be friendly toward Russia. It would be enough if they were neutral. Then we could start working on German-Russian relations again. We could also work on rehabilitating all those people who did nothing wrong. People who, for example, provided humanitarian aid in the Donbass, like Leon Kilinch. And yes, what I also wish for is that we can once again travel freely back and forth. Of course, in Germany, we don't just have family. We also have, let's say, emotional and personal places that will always connect us to Germany. For me, that's my mother's grave. It's also the country of my nationality. And what I want to say above all is this. I haven't done anything wrong. I haven't killed anyone. I haven't stolen anything. All I did was take the freedom in Germany to speak my mind openly. And that alone was apparently so unwelcome that I'm now being treated like a criminal for it.
Olga Petersen says she wants to see a return to freedom of speech in Germany and a government that puts its own people first. Thank you very much. Here at Against the Current, we show you viewpoints you won't hear in the propaganda media. Subscribe to our channel.
Abonnieren Sie unseren Kanal.